Have you ever played a game where the player has access to several different weapons or 20 different combat moves, and somehow every fight still starts to feel the same? And then there are games where the player uses just one weapon, and the combat still stays sharp and engaging. So, what's the difference? Why do some combat systems stay interesting, while others start to feel repetitive even with more tools? Welcome to Game Design Dimension. In this new What Is series, we break down the game design ideas and concepts that shape how games feel to play. Today, we're talking about combat depth. Combat depth is the measure of how many meaningful and distinct choices a player can make during a typical combat encounter. A combat system with depth allows multiple different approaches to a fight. At the same time, it also pushes the player into tactics they might not naturally prefer. The tension between player preference and what the game asks for is often where combat starts becoming engaging. In Doom games, as hordes of enemies attack the player is not just choosing weapons, but constantly making decisions about spacing and positioning. Combat is constantly asking the player to keep moving, manage distance, and push forward instead of retreating or standing still. Those spacing and positioning choices, combined with weapon choice and enemy prioritization, add depth to Doom's combat. In God of War Ragnarok, combat depth often comes from weapon switching and tactical asks from the player. Some enemies ask for a specific weapon first to break an elemental lock, and then allow the player to switch back to a preferred weapon. Certain situations force shield bashes, while unblockable attacks force evasion. This type of system intentionally breaks the rhythm the player is building and asks them to adapt. In Black Myth Wukong, the player is constantly deciding whether stamina should be spent on attacking, evading, or repositioning. Every action consumes stamina. That alone forces meaningful choices with a simple resource bar. Abilities that rely on a limited mana pool add another layer, because the player is again choosing what to spend limited resources on. Even a single system like stamina management can create deep decision making when every action carries a cost. The more often a game changes what the player needs to focus on, the deeper the combat tends to feel. That is the core idea of combat depth. Combat depth also comes from how distinct the player's options feel. Weapons, tools, and abilities need to be functionally different from each other. Each option should solve a different combat problem. In Marvel's Spider-Man 2, an electric web can stun an enemy, while a concussive blast launches them away. Even though both are tools, they ask the player to think differently. In Ghost of Tsushima, a smoke bomb can be used to hide and re-engage, or escape when the player is overwhelmed. A black powder bomb deals area damage. A kunai can quickly interrupt or take out a small enemy. These tools themselves add depth, but the way they combine with the rest of the toolkit adds even more. Depth can also come from how much the player can master a single weapon. Take Devil May Cry games or the older God of War games. Here, depth comes from chain combos, launchers, air combos, and juggles. The weapon stays the same, but the player's understanding and use of the weapon keeps growing. Each type of enemy in the game should ideally ask for a different response from the player. A game can have potentially different approaches to a tank enemy as compared to a ranged enemy. Different required combat responses is another major source of combat depth. In Batman Arkham Knight, a shield enemy must be jumped over, while a stun baton enemy must be dodged before Batman can begin attacking. In Ghost of Yotei, Atsu must use her dual katanas to deal with spear-holding enemies, while she needs to use the Odachi blade for brute enemies. In this rock-paper-scissors-like combat system, players immediately know what is being asked of them, and the game is constantly forcing them to change their engagement strategy. The moment the same answer works for every enemy, combat usually starts flattening out. The kind of combat depth the game needs also depends on the player fantasy. In Batman Arkham Knight, the fantasy is hand-to-hand combat dominance and use of cool bat gadgets. In Halo Infinite, the fantasy is that of a super soldier, using firearms, grenades, and vehicles to control space and the encounter. So combat depth should always support the fantasy the game is trying to deliver. But not all games need a particularly deep combat system. Take the older Assassin's Creed games, for example. The core fantasy here is stealth. The player is meant to get in, eliminate the target quickly, and escape. In fact, if direct combat becomes too deep, it can start working against the stealth fantasy. Compare that to Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Valhalla. These move much more into RPG combat systems with lots of weapons, abilities, and more head-on encounters. These shift the player fantasy from assassin to warrior adventurer. So combat depth does not simply come from adding more weapons or more moves. It comes from the unique feel and use case that is, how distinct each of these player options feel. Distinct options like unique tools, weapons, and moves, along with less tangible options like positioning and resource management, all combine to define the feel of a combat system. And all of that needs to support the player fantasy the game is trying to create. The moment one strategy solves every fight, combat usually starts to feel flat. So the next time you play a combat game, think about which choices the game asks the player to make. The more meaningful and engaging those choices are, the deeper the combat system will feel.